Welcome to part 3 on race and slavery. Now we're going to talk about American slavery. In tracing American slavery, we have to begin with the Portuguese, right? When the Portuguese were exploring around the coast of Africa, and they therefore will establish African slavery, right? As they were traveling down the coast of Africa, trying to see how far south they can go, and if there was a bottom of Africa that they could sail around, they did so under the authority of Pope Nicholas V. Pope Nicholas V had issued 2 papal bulls that the Portuguese could use to justify their actions in Africa. The first one was called the Doom Diversis. The Doom Diversis was issued on the 18th of June, 1452, right? This papal bull was followed up on January 5th, 1455. It was called the Romanus Pontifex, right? The first one, Doom Diversis, allowed the Portuguese to reduce any, quote, Saracens and pagans and any unbelievers and any other non-Christians in the extended dominion to a state of enslavement. So in other words, if they run across people here along the African coast who are not Christians and will not be converted to Christians, they can enslave them. So by papal bull, they have justification of enslavement. Okay, this will be reinforced by the Romanus Pontifex, right? And we give them claim to the lands as well. Okay, so one of the trade partners that they had there along the coast was the local African kingdom of Benin, right, which would trade in captured members of rival nations, right? As the African slave trade began to grow along the slave coast, right, you're going to start seeing African nations going to war with each other, and they would therefore capture the defeated, right, and sell them to the Portuguese. So the Portuguese weren't even very heavily involved in the rounding up of Africans for enslavement. They had a stream of them coming to them to the coast as it was, right? Now, the need for slaves and African slaves was heavily driven by sugar and rum, right? This all begins with the Cape Verde Islands. This is where you're going to have the first of these experimental sugar plantations. Now, Cape Verde Islands are actually off the coast of Africa there. It's sugar plantations that's going to use African slavery to run it, right? But then that's going to expand out once you're going to have the discovery of the American continents, right? You're going to see sugar plantations begin to operate over there. People like Bartolome de las Casas of Spain is going to encourage the Spanish king to use African slave labor in those plantations because of the massive amount of die-off of Native Americans that they could have used for slaves, but the disease and stuff from the Columbian exchange had a pretty profound effect on that. And so as a result of that, both the Portuguese and the Spanish are going to start bringing large numbers of slaves to first the Caribbean, places like Hispaniola, but then eventually across all of the Americas. This is going to lead to what is known as the Great Triangle of Trade. You're going to have sugar produced in the Caribbean that typically will find its way up to New England for the production of rum, which will make it back into Europe and that region in order to get used to purchase more slaves that would then be returned to the Caribbean. So as I mentioned before, the first slaves arrived in the American colonies in 1619 in Jamestown, right, when 20 slaves were exchanged for goods on actually it was an English ship. It's actually a myth that it was a Dutch ship. John Rolfe actually wrote the account, and he didn't want it to be an English ship that had dropped it off, so he changed it to Dutch. So these first 20 slaves that got dropped off in Jamestown in 1619 were sold, but they weren't sold as slaves. They were actually sold as indentured servants because in Jamestown and in Virginia in general, there were no laws on slavery on the books. Matter of fact, you won't have the first laws on the books in Virginia on slavery until 1654, right? Some almost 40 years later that you're going to have slavery officially sanctioned, right? Now, ultimately, you're going to have slavery by 1750. Slavery is going to be legal in every single American colony, right? All 13 of them. And predominantly, it's going to be used in commercial agriculture. Initially, tobacco was the big crop that was needing a lot of labor and a lot of slave labor at that, right? So in the South, you're going to have a massive amount of slaves coming into this region for the purpose of growing tobacco. Now, ultimately, tobacco, which depletes the soil of nitrates really quick, will give way to other crops that are a little bit more stable, or I guess I should say sustainable. While this was going on and slavery was becoming more and more entrenched in colonial America, it was actually dying out in England itself, back in the mother country. For example, in 1706, in a court case called Smith versus Brown and Cooper, it was determined by this court that, quote, as soon as a Negro comes into England, he becomes free. So that means if you were an African and you were a slave and you arrived in England proper, the moment you set foot on English soil, you were now a free man. Now, this didn't apply to any of their colonies, so needless to say, the American colonies still had slavery, as did the other British possessions. But this is way back in 1706. You're already going to see a movement in England begin that's going to be geared towards ending slavery. Right? In 1787, you'll have the first Abolitionist society created in England, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. They're going to begin pushing for the end of the Atlantic slave trade, which by 1787 was dominated by the British. Right? The Portuguese initially dominated, that they were overtaken by the Dutch, and then once the Royal Navy controlled the Atlantic Ocean, they also controlled the Atlantic slave trade. So they're going to begin pushing for the end of the slave trade. In 1799, the enslavement of Scottish coal miners will finally come to an end. So in England proper, they'd ended African slavery in 1706. In 1799, they finally ended Scottish slavery, right? Kind of a bit of irony there, right? In 1807, the Society for the Abolition of the Slave Trade finally had their great success. In 1807, England is going to pass a law that's going to officially abolish the slave trade, right? The Atlantic slave trade. Now, other nations will eventually follow suit, right? When the Royal Navy controls the seas, they can kind of press that and force that on other nations. For example, the United States will pass a similar law in 1808. Spain will approve a law in a similar law in 1813 through a treaty through England, etc., right? In 1834, England finally abolished all slavery throughout all of its empire. I always kind of found this one little piece of irony is that had the United States, had the colonists lost the American Revolution, slavery would have ended in the United States 31 years earlier than it actually did. While this was going on in colonial America, there was growing arguments both for and against slavery. There were biblical arguments, and again, the biblical arguments were both pro and con. For example, Benjamin Rush is going to give a speech in 1773 that's going to be adamantly against slavery, that's going to cite biblical references to support his point. He says, there are some among us who plead as a motive for importing and keeping the slaves that they become acquainted with the principles of religion in our country. This is like justifying highway robbery because part of the money acquired in this manner was appropriated for some religious use. Christianity will never be propagated by any other methods than those employed by Christ and his apostles. Slavery is an engine as little fitted for that purpose as the fire or the sword. A Christian slave is a contradiction in terms. So see a very strong biblical argument against slavery. However, you're going to have Richard Nisbet is going to give a speech the same year in 1773 that's going to use the Bible to support slavery. He's going to say, the scriptures, instead of forbidding it, declare it lawful. The divine legislature, Moses says, both thy bondmen and thy bondmaids, which thou shalt have, shall be the heathen that are round about you. Of them shall ye buy, and of their families that are with you, which they beget in your lands, they shall be your possession. Our Savior's general maxims of charity and benevolence cannot be mentioned as proofs against slavery. If the custom had been in abhorrence by Christ and his disciples, they would, no doubt, have preached against it in direct terms. So see, there's a biblical argument in favor of slavery, again, using the Bible as reference. Legal arguments, of course, are abound. For taxation purposes, something we'll talk a little bit more about here in a second. Things like, how do you count slaves for taxation and representation? Defense. Alexander Hamilton, during the American Revolution, felt that northern slaves escaped to the north should be used in the military, and that Negroes, Africans should be allowed to enlist. And he'll say in a letter to John Jay in 1779, he says, it is a maximum with some great military judges that with sensible officers, soldiers can hardly be too stupid. I mention this because I frequently hear it objected to the scheme of embodying Negroes that they are too stupid to make soldiers. I foresee that this project will have to combat much opposition and prejudice and self-interest. So he's saying here, it says, I keep getting told that you can't have an African as a soldier because he's just too stupid to be a soldier. And my counter argument to that is that even if that was true, with a good officer, they say that wouldn't matter, right? So there's all kinds of different arguments. It even comes up when we take a look at the Constitution. When the founders were drafting the Constitution, they had a real opportunity here, an opportunity to eliminate slavery in what has become the United States of America. However, to do that also would have been to alienate the entire southern colonies, and you probably wouldn't have gotten them to join. Right? This is why that the word slavery doesn't even show up in the Constitution. They don't use that term. They use a nice little convenient secondary term called held to service or labor. Right? Like, for example, Article 4, Section 2, which is in the Constitution and specifically protects slavery, states, no person held to such labor, service or labor, see there it is, no person held to such service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall be in any consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered upon the claim of the party for whom such service or labor may be due. See, they don't use slavery, but it protects slavery. And then, of course, there is that matter of representation, right? And what they determined was that a slave counts as 3/5 as a person. By having that in the Constitution, that saying a slave person held in service and labor count as 3/5 of a person, you have validated slavery in the document.